There we go. Yeah, I was just thinking. Yeah, I've heard a lot of your golden radio voice, but now I'm hearing it
Yeah, the real thing.
in a way, in a way, the real thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where do we start? Yeah, yeah, I've really appreciated your work. I mean, I've listened to a lot of your shows. I read your recent biography of Illich. Rivers North of the Future, really important book for me too. And so,
Good.
yeah, it's lovely to get the chance to talk. And I guess one thing I wanted to mention just off the top, I sent the piece, the piece I wrote for Plow that I sent to you.
Yes, I read it with pleasure.
And I was wondering if you noticed, I was very much drawing on your work at one point. There's a passage from your Illich biography on page 12 that really got me. Where I can just read it, and you
Yeah,
might.
please remind me.
So you're talking about Jesus calling the first disciples, and he said, when Jesus bumps into the brothers Peter and Andrew fishing, he says only, "Follow me." They receive no other explanation or instruction as to why they should on the instant turn their lives upside down. In the Bible, Illich says, a peremptory summons of this kind is the primary form of causation. Things happen neither by chance nor by necessity, but in response to a call that is often heard only by the one to whom it is addressed. Everything depends on that disposition to listen and to respond, which Illich calls obedience. And I think that kind of disposition there, as I understand your work, that's almost close to the heart of what you're pointing to in the biography. Would that be fair to say? That kind of, or yeah, could you maybe talk about?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you, I like hearing that. One is often surprised, because I'm involved in daily struggles to write, to hear something has finally been fairly well expressed. It's good. And I think that is a kind of nub or gist or essence of Illich there. I mean, particularly the idea that this is a primary form of causation. This is a way in which we could see the world, right? That how things appear to us would be very, very different if we looked with those eyes. Like, what is calling us, rather than seeing either chance or necessity as the governing principles. So yes, I think, in my very first, after Illich surprised me, we had met a couple of times in the 60s, and he had come to Toronto at my request at one point. But when we really got connected in the later 1980s, it was exactly such a thing that occurred, right? Which that he told me when I said I would like to do a series of interviews with him, that was completely out of the question, that he had ceased to do such things long since. And then the next day, somehow seeing me with my family at the conference we were both, he was addressing, I was covering for Ideas, he changed his mind. Just, I think, in just such a way. He experienced a changed state in relation to me and followed it. So he said, write to my friend Wolfgang Sachs, etc. So when I received a letter from him later on and asking me to come to where he was, he used that word, obedience, that he would be obedient. And I was, at that time, I don't think I had any understanding at all of what he meant by obedience, right? Obedience to me meant uncritical following. So yes, the very beginning of what turned out to be a momentous encounter for both of us, in the sense that it changed my life, but also in the sense that it changed his, because what I think is disclosed in The Rivers North of the Future, which you mentioned at the start, and which to me is indeed an important book, quite apart from my involvement with it, that wouldn't seemingly have occurred had that connection not been made, and I had not been the stubborn person I was in repeatedly asking him for that. So he trusted, I mean, and that's very remarkable to me, because, as I say, I regard it as a crucially important book, and think it could be so to all who are interested in Christianity and its fate. It might not have existed if a certain person hadn't knocked or asked, or, you know. So it's a different way of seeing, it's a different way of living, and it was the way that he took and showed to others.
I mean, that, to think of it as a form of causation is such a fascinating idea. And I guess this opens up an area I've been thinking about. It seems that there's a very common kind of critique that'll be made of our technological society or our approach to science, that'll frame it in terms of kind of a sort of masculine, sort of aggressive masculine sort of penetration of the natural world, a rape of its resources, so essentially critiquing our use of the natural world, and also our use of tools. And I think obviously that's a very valid way of critiquing, how we approach technology, how we approach the natural world. But as you're thinking here of causality, of a different way of seeing reality, what I'm curious about is, once we've accepted this kind of sort of masculine, perverted masculine use of tools, what do you think would a different, more positive vision of use or causality look like? Does that kind of make sense? I mean, if we've critiqued this is a sort of overreach of tools, this is an overreach of technology, what would a positive vision of use look like? I don't know if that is a clear question.
Well, I think it's a clear question, but looking into Illich, there's two texts that come to mind. The first is Tools for Conviviality, and the second is a paper in shadow work called Research by People. And in Tools for Conviviality, he's essentially calling for a principle of, let's say, enoughness, sufficiency, but admitting that it can't be specified. All certain principles can be enunciated about it. You can, but because the human equilibrium is open, where the point of balance is will obviously depend on the situation you're in. And so the best he really can do is in that paper, Research by People, where he draws on Hugh of St. Victor, his great friend and interlocutor from the 12th century, who, according to Illich, is the first to really identify such a thing as a tool, or as we now say, technology in the modern sense, as something that had never been conceived by human beings before, according to Illich. But Hugh gives him the principle that he calls remedy. So Hugh, reading the story in Genesis, says that obviously we're not in the environment we were adapted. That very pleasant garden that we were adapted for is not where we're living, and therefore we can be cut by every thorn and hurt by the cold, and therefore we need to improve our situation, right? So that principle is actually a pretty interesting one, I think, the principle of remedy. And it can be applied, I think, even in very advanced technological circumstances. So I'll tell you a story of how I applied it. A couple of years ago, I started to get a little heart attacks in the proper sense, but angina, quite nasty. And I went to the hospital. I had an angiogram, and before I knew it, a surgeon turned up and told me that I would require an emergency quintuple bypass, which he would execute later in the week. He didn't think there was any question about it. And no, you'd be a fool to refuse. It's just fancy sewing, he says. I was astonished, and after some reflection, checked myself out of the hospital. And I did have Ivan in mind in various ways, because he had spoken to me once about people who had their hearts rewired, and I had no understanding of what was proper at that point. Right? What is the heart? Right? Anybody who's ever sung a country song or read the Bible will know that the heart is a great deal more than the supposed pump that it is sometimes taken for in crude physiological terms. This was the question of my heart, right? So, did I need this? Was the question then? Was it proper to have it? It's a huge question, right? Because it's not just me, but it's the whole world of what Illich once called posthumous longevity, right? People who are maintained forever, right? It's a whole question of what is the hour of my death? Is that something that's personal to me that I could potentially find and embrace? That I could die, which was a huge thing with Ivan always, right? That people had that death as something that people do had been taken away and put under administration. So I don't want to give my medical history here. The point is, I got better. I never had that surgery. I feel fine. But I don't think I would ever have said, do I need this, if I hadn't had such a teacher, and I think there are a lot of people who don't say, what is enough? The question, what is enough, is a powerful, powerful question, I think. What is good for us would be another way of saying that, right? What is proper to us, or what is good for us, would be another way of beginning a conversation about a limit, right? Given what I said initially, which is that you can never specify a limit, right? I mean, we've got such a thing going on at the moment with zero emissions, right? The whole disguise under which a new industrial revolution is being launched it's an attempt to draw a line in the sand, but that's not, I think that's not the way we should be going, right? So is that an answer at all?
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's the beginning of an answer, I suppose. I mean, another thing I was thinking about is what about, so Illich has these notions of proportionality, of enoughness, of limits. And how do you think that, I think you've maybe already alluded to this, but how do you think that's different from the older concept of something like natural law? Do you think he's thinking of something similar or analogous to natural law language, or is it importantly different in some ways? What do you say?
Well, I'm not at all.
What did Illich think of? I mean, as a Catholic, what did he think of the whole language of natural law in Catholic theology?
Well, I'm far from being knowledgeable about the natural law tradition, but he always said that he was a contemporary natural. Well, he didn't always say it. He several times said it, that he was a contemporary natural law theorist. But the caveat would be that from the very beginning of his career as a churchman, he insisted that tradition and innovation were an indissoluble pair. There wasn't one or the other, but they were two sides of the same coin, however you want to say it. So tradition must be radically new to succeed. But on the other hand, innovation must be radically traditional to succeed. So obviously he's not, although he claimed that he was a traditionalist, a lover of the old ways, and he conceived tradition as a spirit or a grasp, not as a set of practices, right? So whenever he discussed the revival of things that have been lost, he always specified that they would revive in a radically new form. So I guess he was a natural law theorist, and he said the same about Aquinas, as a matter of fact, that he was the whole architecture of his thought in a certain way had come from his studies with Jacques-Marie Ten of the works of Thomas Aquinas. And yet he said, Aquinas cannot just be moved into modern times, right? It's a habit of thought which might produce radically different results in new circumstances, right?
Just to interject with I was reading over the summer a book called The Women Are Up to Something. Maybe you came across it.
I don't know it. No, I'm just smiling at the title. It's
a wonderful title, but I mean it's alluding to these four women who kind of Mary Midgley, Elizabeth Anscombe, Iris Murdoch.
Oh yes, I did read a review of it. Yeah.
And what the title is alluding to is that during I believe it was during the war, all the men kind of went off to to fight in the war, and so there was no one left in the university except the women and the conscientious objectors, and so this sort of gave these women an opportunity to actually to be heard in a way that wouldn't have been possible in the kind of male-dominated university prior to the war. And so these women kind of, in their own way, sort of develop a philosophical outlook that, in my mind, is quite parallel to what Illich is up to. Some of them, like Philippa Foot, is drawing. I think it's Anscombe is drawing on Aquinas, but others like Mary Midgley was looking at spent decades researching sort of new developments in biology, and kind of looking at the sort of structural, the form of different creatures, and then trying to discern what is the sort of, what is the proportionality of a human being, and then kind of drawing an ethics from the kinds of creatures we are. So if you're familiar with any of those thinkers, do you see a kind of an analogy between them and Illich?
Well, I was lucky to meet Mary Midgley towards the end of her life, and there's a little interview with her in that series called How to Think About Science, which is still on the CBC website. And I'm just now reading The Sovereignty of Good, Iris Murdoch. So I hadn't read much of Murdoch's philosophy. I had read a little bit of her writing on Simone Weil and some of her novels, but so broadly, I'm not quite competent to answer. I think Midgley's critique of science certainly comports very well with Illich, but I don't think I can answer more than that. I'm not well enough versed in those philosophers. I mean, except very broadly speaking, the answer I think must be yes.
I was just reading, as I was reading, I thought, this there's definitely a congruence here. I'm wondering where to go now with this. I mean, if I could circle back in our conversation a bit to a different topic. I mean, I wonder. I mean, as I was listening to some of your earlier shows, I think you have one. What is it called? The age, the New Age or something? Is it called the New Age?
Well, there's one called History in the New Age.
Yeah.
There's one called Between Two Ages. I was very taken up with the metaphor of a new age in the early 80s.
Yeah. So there's those shows, you can see a connection with some of your later work, but also some interesting differences. And I'm curious about I mentioned in some of the questions I sent that I've sometimes called you a sort of whimsically called you an intellectual hippie. I don't know if that's but
I would proudly accept that. Very, very proudly.
And so I'm really curious if you could as someone who didn't grow up in the 60s and has only kind of heard about the 60s, I'm curious if you could describe what was in the air in the 60s. How do you see your own work as coming out of the 60s, or also maybe moving beyond it or critiquing it? And you've also talked about Illich in his earlier work as a more public facing intellectual, as seeing this as a sort of potential threshold where it was possible to move into a new kind of space. And I wonder, could you kind of describe what was the space of possibility there? And
you'll know the parable of the wine skins, that if the old new wine is put into the old skins, it will burst them. So you need new skins for new wine. If we stay with Illich, who was certainly one of many prophetic voices in the 60s, he saw it as a moment of kairos, in the New Testament language, of an interruption of chronological time, an opening, a moment of realization. And he later developed the idea of counterproductivity, right? That our institutions were all, roughly speaking, at a threshold at which, if they were not restrained, right? If they were not fitted in to a new way of life, they would become counterproductive monsters, which is not a bad description of the things that we're confronting now, right? Vast, unmanageable systems, all of which cost more than any decent society would ever be able to afford to pay without being in a constant state of hyper production, and completely, I think I said already, completely ungovernable, unmanageable. We have these spasms of reforming healthcare, but reforming healthcare always just involves spending more money on healthcare and saying we should reform healthcare. Education is the same. You could go on. So it was a moment of realization, and I think it was, to a certain extent, in the air. I mean, for me, the most important memory that would come up insistently would be reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters from Prison, his reflections on Christianity without religion, on man come of age, as he says. And that's also shot through all of Illich's writings of the 60s, right? That this is a moment of turning around. However, according to I think what actually occurred is that most of the new wine was poured into the old skins, and that the craziness we're living in now is a kind of Stalinist phase of that mistaken revolution, right? If we look in terms of Illich's career, the crucial moment is 1980 to 82. The essays in shadow work, and then gender above all, represents a decisive break between Illich and the social movements that he had thought to counsel, cultivate, and be part of. He instead is denounced as a reactionary, and although he continued in some ways to be a kind of honored uncle to the green movements in Europe, essentially he was sidelined, right? A new story began to unfold, and I think, for me, just speaking personally, culminated in the pandemic, which I took as a revelation of a terrifying new social order, in which the health religion is completely established, right? The worship of life, which Illich denounced, is at the center, and a whole complex of life, safety, etc., governs as a new sovereign, and the people, by and large, are obedient, in the bad sense, since we gave the good sense of obedience before. So yeah, I think, and meanwhile, to add one more dimension to the story, that the 60s are increasingly covered over, let's say, obscured. And I don't even like to speak about the 60s, because this is really a much longer movement in time, right? I mean, the revelation of the mushroom cloud at Alamogordo is already the beginning of the 60s in the sense in which we're speaking, because it's the beginning of the revelation that war is obsolete, and so on. So the 50s are part of the 60s, in other words, and the 70s are part of the 60s, and we're really talking about a long sweep in time. And the 20s were actually, in a certain way, a rehearsal for the 60s, and maybe the 90s were also a rehearsal for the 20s. So in the end, you probably would be better off taking the whole package of decadism and throwing it on the scrap heap and saying, this is not a good way to conceive the movement of history. But if we stay with the 60s, then the 60s is increasingly covered over. It becomes a bit of pop cultural lore, right? You've seen the montage 1,000 times, right? 2 minutes of Woodstock, 2 minutes of Chicago, et cetera, right? It all becomes a kind of cliche, right? And it's apocalyptic meaning, if I can speak that way to you, is lost, right? And indeed, the word apocalypse is a mostly ruined word, because everyone knows it means some sort of physical catastrophe, and not a revelation, not an opening out of the implications of what has been going on. Yeah. So, but I do think, I didn't answer one thing, which, again, to quote Ivan, that this was a real phenomenon, right? That he met young people who came to CDOC in Cuernavaca, his institute, who were ready to make, as he said, a new world right now. And, Robert Frost says, I preach the one-man revolution, the only revolution that's coming, right? Is the only revolution that counts is the change of heart. So, and he was meeting people whose hearts had been changed. And I think people's hearts were changed, and some stuck with it. So that's why I'm proud to be called an intellectual hippie. Well, it's not a very good name, but as I've been saying, none of our names are very good, because we're living in a field of ruined words, and that's a hard place to be. I was completely persuaded at the beginning of the pandemic that I wouldn't, that my one experience with this was catastrophic, and no, that's a bridge too far. And I've had wonderful experiences, and have completely changed my orientation.
Towards doom. I've had there's definitely a kind of when there's kind of a technological purity that one can want to maintain, and I've had to acknowledge the fact that I've had friendships and amazing conversations and real connections with people that happened over Zoom, over online spaces, and you just sort of have to acknowledge that. For me that was a bit, and I think that is a common misconception about maybe someone like Illich or people who are making these critiques of technology. It's not that technology critiques are saying, well, we need to return to the Garden of Eden or something. But they're saying that you need to use tools in a human way. You need to return to a sense of proportionality.
Yeah, his whole relationship with me as a radio broadcaster was exceptional, in the sense that he made an exception, and he himself was a major jet setter, because I think quite properly he responded to calls in that respect. And So yeah, you can't, you
But
have to draw your lines in the circumstances in which you're living.
but I mean, so he made an exception for you, but isn't that because you were also an exception? I mean, I don't know what the world was like when you were doing CBC ideas, but I can't imagine anybody, putting the kinds of shows you were doing on radio today.
Well, uh, that seems to be the case, although a great deal of such stuff has gone into the internet broadcast world.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think it is somewhat true at the CBC. Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe to pick up where we left off
Yeah,
with
where were we?
with the 1960s. I mean,
we just saved the 60s. So what's next?
um, I mean, do you think of part of us thinking back to the 1960s is just how these apocalyptic moments often go? Is you have this sort of moment of seeing of a kind of collective coming together, and then as time passes, you start to have people break off into factions and different interpretations and different outlooks, so that now looking back, you probably see people probably see many different 1960s, and what the 1960s mean for some people is very different than what it might represent or mean for others, and so there's a kind of fragmentation of that, of that moment.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, and you could probably write a pretty good history of the branching points, right? So Illich, gender, the direction feminism would take, that's a branching point, right? Similarly, the sort of whole earth catalog, whole earth review strand, let's say represented by Stuart Brand, the embrace of a cybernetic worldview is another branching point, right? So there are many branching points.
I mean, what's interesting about your shows, from your earlier shows, is you can already see the different groups that you were seeing as part of this broader movement, but you can already see the tensions within the people you've brought together.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Much more than I probably knew at the time. But so.
And now, how would you let's hold on to this point of cybernetics. I want to get back to that, but how do you see the moment we're in now? I mean, you've mentioned and you've written some excellent pieces on the pandemic. Do you see, as we've now moved into I think more or less a post-COVID world or something, where it's less dominant? Do you see a kind of recognition, growing recognition of some of what you were arguing in those pieces, and maybe as a slightly to get a slightly different question to tack onto that is, how do you see the current moment we're in? I mean, you can see it in terms of a heightened cynicism, but at the same time, I mean, you've quoted Ambigin as saying that Illich has come into his moment of recognition, as the sort of institutions he was critiquing have blown up even larger. But I wonder, do you also see kind of movements or possibilities within our time that seem to be pointing to a different kind of threshold or a different kind of opening? How do you see the current moment in all of this?
There's quite a few different ways to answer that. but there's some beautiful pages at the end of Rivers North of the Future, where Ivan talks about his friends, and says that that at the end of what he calls the age of instrumentality, or the age of tools, right, where an extraordinary intensity of instrumental purpose has prevailed in Western civilizations, and other cultures influenced by it, or dominated by it, and that what that hides, that intensity of instrumental purpose, is a feeling for what he calls gratuity, which is already another difficult word because it just means some trivial consideration, a tip. It's a gratuitous remark. It's a tip. The feeling for what has no purpose that we can identify, what is beautiful, what is present now in this moment. And he talks about how much the young people that he is associating with, and that who were his friends and who were listening to him also, I mean, that they have a different sensibility. And so in that sense, he feels there is an opening between worlds, between social states or regimes. I take the pandemic as representing the coming of age, the setting hard or fast of the new order, which is a new epistemic order, it's a new spiritual order, and to an extent, it's a new political order as well. But I think those who have opened themselves remain. I mean, here we are, and how we are to live and what kind of institutions we can devise. I mean, one has the metaphor of the monasteries, right? That Benedict and his brothers withdraw from the failing Roman civilization, and William Rowan Thompson used to say that they miniaturized the ancient civilization as a curriculum for a new age. It's a kind of interesting image. But what bursts forth in Europe after the 11th century, and which is, prefigured in the Carolingian Renaissance and so on, I mean, you can't be precise about it, has to some extent been nurtured for good and ill in those monasteries, right? Well, respecting what we said before about tradition and innovation, right? That this is not necessarily a walled enclosure that we're looking for. I do think I identify with some neo-monastic, if I can say that, attempt to keep certain things alive. Whether this is a sundering of worlds, or whether this is something kept alive at the margins that can play back in at a later point, that's beyond me. I'm at the end of my days. But I do think there are some, can I say, ethics that are associated with that. A certain way of living, being, talking, acting, that must at all costs be kept alive.
I mean, I really resonate with that. I'm thinking of a book by Angela Nagel, another interesting title coming up for you, but it's called To Kill All Normies. And she traces the way that in certain internet subcultures, the sort of language of critique, of revolution, of sort of being countercultural or anti-establishment, has sort of now both infected the dominant discourse on the left and the right. So you have, on the one hand, the Trumpian movement, who sees itself as, we are the anti-establishment, we're the real radicals. And of course, you see the same thing on the left. And I've been thinking, maybe Alan Jacobs talks of instead of thinking in terms of revolution, we need to think in terms of repair. And I think that sort of connects with your image of the monastery as holding on, as finding forms of life and finding language that holds on to or preserves or holds on to human forms of existence, that kind of preserves what's good in the world, as opposed to sort of this endless language of critique. And I've been kind of more and more drawn to just
I would say that Bruno Latour, who contrasted a French philosopher and historian of science who just died recently, was a great teacher of mine. But Bruno says he contrasts composition with critique. But that's, I think, probably quite equivalent to Jacob's distinction between revolution and repair, right? It's all saying the same thing, and it's all trying to derive the good out of a limit situation, right? If you are able to see that this thing can't go any farther, right? Or that what it goes into is inhuman, post-human, and you say it as you like, right? It's forms of genetic manipulation that will completely that will wring the last shreds of meaning out of human existence, or it's artificial intelligence that will render human beings completely beside the point, that they'll just be an inferior form of computer, and not very fast. Not very fast computers. If you see that, and which is not really different than seeing the cloud over Alamogordo, right? The revelation has been in progress for quite some time, but it's starker now. And presumably, the starker it gets, the more people might be able to see it, right?
One of my teachers here, Rod Rayner,
I know Rod from Marcus Rempel, I think, right?
Yeah,
Marcus and my pal Wayne Northey out west. That's one of the ways in which Zoom became a different thing to me. They organized this discussion group about Illich and the book that was so rich and rewarding, and included people I have, including Rod, that I've never, shaken hands with.
Yeah.
So I know Rod a little bit.
Yeah. He teaches a course here called Ethical Living in a Technological Society, where he just marches us through all the major critics of technology, from some readings from Marx, some readings from Ellul, of course, from Marcuse, from Illich, and all the rest, Borgman. And one kind of sort of thing he often emphasized is that Illich is operating in a kind of apophatic mode, and this is something that you pointed out in your own work too. that that the sort of revelation of the starkness of the reality we inhabit can be kind of flipped around so that you can see the possibility of an alternative. And so it's interesting that there's a form of hope that can be found in the hopelessness.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's right. And there's a passage to that effect in Rivers North of the Future. I can't tell you where it is right now, but where he says that that the unfolding of the incarnation proceeds, we can see now, partly via the mystery of evil, but that door is no less, I don't know how he says it, but something like that. It's no less worthy to be entered or understood because you enter through the back door. You enter in effect through the back door, right? You see what it should be by understanding its perversion, right? Which is arguably how human beings learn everything, right? William Blake says you never know what is enough until you know what is more than enough. So yeah.
That's true. I mean, this is connected to our discussion of the current moment, but yeah, I hope this isn't a question that'll get you in trouble or anything, but I'm interested in the rise of our fellow Canadian Jordan Peterson, and I wonder, what do you make of his work, if you've interacted with it, and what his rise means for our moment? I mean, on some level, his work on myth makes him sound like the kind of person you would have interviewed back in the day on ideas. But maybe some other sides of his work are pointing in a different direction. But I'm curious, what did you make of him as a cultural phenomenon, and what do you think he says about our current moment?
Well, I'm not very much versed in Jordan Peterson's work other than his journalism, which has been considerable, and so I haven't. So around the time that he sort of announced himself with his opposition to current legislation and the insistence that certain pronouns be used and so on, people began to say, you should interview Jordan Peterson. And a lot of people said that to me, as if somehow I could bring out what was implied in what he was saying, or that. So I thought he was probably doing something heroic, something that probably involved a great personal cost. There's always there tends to be an assumption that anybody who becomes famous has wanted to become famous, and it's essentially a vanity. I didn't see that. I thought maybe he did something, brave. Lately, I don't know. I don't know what it did to him, but there's something brittle and aggressive in recent things that I've seen that I tend to turn it off, to be truthful. I don't know what it means. I know he's had a very beneficial influence on some young, as is often said, on some young men that I know and love, that he gave them courage, he gave them heart, he gave them something good. And I think he's done something good, but I don't quite know where he's at now.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll leave it there.
yeah, yeah, that resonates with me. I mean, I was I was initially drawn to his work through his biblical lectures, and he was giving a kind of mythological reading of, or
And that I
something.
don't know at all, although I'm a bit of a Jungian
So he was
myself,
drawing on Jung.
so I
He was
can
drawing
imagine. Yeah.
on people even like Northrop Frye. And so that side of his work got me into some of those other areas.
Yeah.
And there was definitely early on, there was definitely a really interesting conversation starting to happen between people within the church and people outside of the church who felt like they had a kind of common language that allowed them to talk about religious matters in a way that that broke open boundaries that people often that kind of broke open the boundaries. And you also saw people who were interested in the new atheists suddenly becoming interested in Christianity or and I mean to get that kind of materialist outlook to appreciate a religious vision of things is no small feat.
Mhm.
And so the space that he opened up there was pretty astounding. But it has felt like in the past few years that side of his work has kind of shrunken away, and you're left with a more politically polarizing figure who who you either have to double down and kind of defend everything he's saying or distance yourself from him. But I've definitely noticed a kind of brittleness as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to speculate about what I don't know anything about. But that polarization is just viciously evident in every aspect of our lives, right? And people are. I mean, I've been writing about this because I'm trying to finish up a book about the CBC, which is a kind of plea for a new CBC and an attempt to argue for it. And in the chapter I just finished, I took the Freedom Convoy as a for instance, right? So here is an incipient public, as I would say, welling up from all of Canada, but notably Western Canada, having all the hallmarks of a new public, right? It's spontaneous, it's relatively leaderless, although influences can be identified. And it's widely supported, right? It's new in the sense that these people do not know each other. It's quite wrong, I think, to see them as just a transport of existing ideologies. Something new is occurring. And you know, it's just, it's impressive just to see it happen. I mean, who wouldn't be impressed to see people get those big rigs rolling in the middle of winter with their livelihoods on the line? I mean, I can't understand really easily why people weren't more impressed, why everybody immediately took sides, right? And that the government didn't see that a public was manifesting, right? But then, you know, the battle starts, the stereotyping starts, the police get involved, right? It's everything in the reaction reinforces what was probably worst to begin with in the manifestation, right? It pushes people more into conspiracy. It pushes them more into anger, right? Because what was beautiful in it I mean, you know, I was amazed in Toronto. When the following weekend there was a demonstration here at Queen's Park, and I have never been in a crowd that was that well disposed. I don't think, right? I don't think I've ever been blessed as many times as I was. I'm an old man. I walk with a cane, right? And the courtesy, the friendliness, the warmth that I experienced that day was very, very impressive. And everybody who went to Ottawa said the same about it, right? But the CBC was right there making up stories about how maybe there was an arson and maybe there was this and maybe there was that and maybe there was a Nazi flag. Everything that could drain the good out of this thing as quickly as possible was done. I mean, it's the prostitution of this newness, right? Of this emergence, the failure to say, let's address this, right? Let's have a conversation, right? Let's begin here, right? Obviously, something's gone wrong here, right? The government imposes a vaccine mandate on a group that's already 90% vaccinated, who've been carrying the mail for the last 2 years while everybody else huddled at home. They pushed too hard and they got a big pushback. And then when the pushback came, they didn't say, oh, here's the pushback. They said, this is a national security threat. So you mean it's a visible revelation of how the good is turned bad. So anyway, this is not particularly relevant to Jordan Peterson, but a lot of people are being forced in, and you know, you see it in politics, right? I mean, it's, how are you going to decide between Trudeau and Poilievre or Biden and DeSantis in the United States, right? Which, pick your poison, right? They're mirrors. They become mirrors of one another. And it's you know, my conceit is that the CBC as a public broadcaster needs to become a true public forum where things can show themselves, where things can develop and grow, and encounters can take place, and people, I mean, ultimately I conceive it as a peacemaking enterprise, because you know, we're in a kind of state of latent civil war, I think. So anyway, those dynamics of polarization are very vicious. That's all.
Yeah, that's you really resonate with that. I mean, yeah, yeah, I do feel like that is becoming a bigger and bigger thing to grapple with. And one thing I was wondering too is how do you, I mean, in many ways, I think the work you've done and Illich's work strives to be a stance that isn't ideological in that sense, that isn't doesn't try to be a position. It doesn't try to sort of jockey for position among other positions. But I guess when you're defending certain ideas, how do you avoid it becoming a kind of brittle political position? Does that kind of make sense? Where how do you prevent your outlook?
Well, I think a position, since we all live in the world and we all live under the reign of necessity, we can't avoid taking positions, we can't say to others, I don't like your position, but personally, I don't have a position, right? I'm above all that, right? I mean, I have a position. Illich made a very cogent argument in the 70s for an expanded political map, right? And an essay called Three Dimensions of Public Choice or Public Option. It has different versions. But he says, in essence, the left-right spectrum has been meaningful. It does refer to something. It does refer relatively to how much public provision is governed by the state and how much it's governed by the market. It's a real issue. But as long as you leave out technological choice, so another axis running, say, from hard to soft, and then you also leave out a third axis, which runs essentially from, he said, from having to being, right? From what makes us able to do things to what makes companies able to sell us things. Then you would have a much more, you would have a better account of the political space. I think that's true, but one in saying so is still taking a position. So I think really the relevant parables, and so I seem to be speaking in parables, is the mote and the beam, right? The question is how aware am I, right? And awareness was always the master term, pardon the expression, in Illich. From the first collection of his work was called Celebration of Awareness, right? There are things that we can't change since we live in the realm of necessity, but we can be aware of, right? So so to me, that runs all the way to the throne of God. We cannot avoid paradox. We cannot avoid contradiction. We live. That's how the world is made. That's how the world holds together. We need 2 feet to walk, and the 2 feet oppose each other, or we wouldn't walk. And so language is built out of oppositions or contradiction. Everything is built out of contradiction. So there are some things only we can be aware of, right? So the CBC can't avoid being a medium, right? But it can be aware of the dynamics of mediation and practice with humility, with awareness, with tact. So I think a lot of it comes down to that, right? That it isn't that we would not have a position, but that we would be aware of our position and aware of others' positions, right? So to go back to the convoy, the Prime Minister says these are unacceptable people. Unacceptable. The CBC says this is not a public. We're a public broadcaster, but these people aren't in the public. We have to they exist to be managed, to be ostracized. They're surplus to our worldview. They don't count. They're not. Yeah. So I think that the principle of peacemaking has become most important to me. And the idea then playing into that of what does it mean to love your enemies? I mean, a piece of nonsensical advice from a practical point of view. What does it mean? So it can only be explained in contradictory terms, wise as serpents, gentle as doves. There will always be 2 parts. it's not I don't think it's a counsel of imprudence, right? Bare your breast to the one who wants to shoot you. No, it means recognize your enemy, right? First of all, it's a counsel of recognition, and that's what I think is missing at the CBC, right? Is the willingness to recognize the other one, and to stop with the stereotypes, right? I mean, this wild recklessness of creating the anti-masker and the anti-vaxxer and the anti-science, all these things that were thrown around in the pandemic, right? Which were all premature polarizations of complicated issues or misinformation, right? So people who themselves were barely informed were so sure that others were misinformed, right? So yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think another key, yeah, I mean, just to tack on what you were saying about peacemaking, I also think of Paul's language of the ministry of reconciliation as what we're called to at this time. And what I also really keep coming back to is you talk in the book, Illich, speaking of I forget the exact turn of phrase, but something like a horrifying earnestness or
brutal earnestness,
or
he had a way with words,
or he did, or a morbid seriousness. And I think that's the loss of the ability to laugh at ourselves, to you've mentioned that it's impossible to live without paradox and contradiction, and not just recognizing the other, but recognizing that about ourselves, that we are this bundle of contradictions, and that we can't ultimately take ourselves too seriously. I think losing sight of that, and then just that kind of brittle sense of certainty about your own position that then develops. I think losing the ability to laugh at your is one of the most disastrous ways we go wrong.
Right. I think that's very deeply in Ivan's understanding from the beginning, right? He says, if I think I've understood a gospel story if it makes me smile, right? Or understanding it's like a joke, right? One person gets it, one person doesn't, right? I think that's humor is our tribute to the ultimacy of paradox. I mean ultimacy. I mean ultimacy in our human horizon, right? Things may be different somewhere else, but that's how they are here. We know that.
To pick up a thread that maybe half an hour ago, but you mentioned cybernetics, and this is one piece of the book that really intrigued me, was your discussion of how we've moved from an age of instrumentality into an age of systems, and you take the paradigm of the cybernetic, of us being integrated into the system, and then this kind of feedback loop that feeds what we put into the system back into the system, so that there's a kind of feedback loop. And what I was curious about is there's this whole discourse that's developed around critiquing an instrumental stance of the agent who sort of stands apart from the world and then kind of acts upon it in a sort of disembedded, disengaged stance. And now I wonder, does the whole language that is developed around embodiment, rootedness, that the interconnectivity of things, the fact that we can't extract ourselves from the world and from our relationships with others, do you think that kind of discourse comes out of a cybernetic awareness? And if so, does it actually feed into the problem rather than moving against it? Does that make sense?
Well, we talked earlier about tradition and innovation being an indissoluble pair. Another is transcendence and immanence. And I think what Illich saw after an initial infatuation with cybernetics, because you can see that in Deschooling Society in the final chapter, not the final, the penultimate chapter, and you can, and he was inviting major people in that field to Cuernavaca, was close friends with Heinz von Forster, and he saw potential in it. And at some point, he concluded that this discourse, taken on the terms on which it was being taken, was completely disembodying, right? And that was what he said. I think he saw a vision of pure immanence, of pure enclosure, which is an example of it would be the way the operator of a system is conceived as part of the system, right? There is no available perspective outside the system. And that's why the language of repair rather than revolution, or composition rather than critique, potentially becomes dangerous if it's just giving in to that pure immanence. So if we go back to the beginning of the modern age, I think it's possible to see that the image of God that developed in nominalist theology, in a certain way, the first scientists take that image on board. They relate to the world. They don't think they're God. They're mostly devout men, but they relate to the world as they think God relates to us. They model their activity on this imagined relationship between God and the world. So there's the perversion of transcendence, right? So a way of understanding where we are is that we've jumped from the perversion of transcendence to the perversion of immanence, and that what we desperately need is a balanced account. So throwing out critical distance isn't going to help, right? But that's in a certain way what Illich's history was. He said that he conceived modern institutions in some sense as tools. It probably makes more sense to use the language of technology for most people, but that even a school system, it's still initially conceived instrumentally as a way of accomplishing a purpose, and that the user stands outside it and could potentially change it, right? So the moment of, oh my God, for him is, but that's not how people think anymore, right? There's been a change of mental space, or in a certain way, the world image has gone from being a book to being a computer. You can think of it a lot of ways, but you're inside. So how are you going to change it if you're inside it? When he doesn't really go farther than that, but for me, it would be getting outside all such images and seeing that you can never do without that pair. transcendence, immanence. And I think that's ultimately what's at stake in the age of tools versus the age of systems, right? Is that you jump from one side of a contradiction to another. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is finally a theological question, right? It's a question about the nature of the world and the nature of God.
Yeah, that's immensely helpful, because I've often wondered about attention in Illich's work of on the one hand, he sort of sees how modernity kind of destroys the vernacular, the kind of cultural embeddedness, the homeworlds. Maybe the world he describes in gender has now been lost. But on the other hand, he describes the freedom of the gospel as the ability to step outside of these homeworlds.
Yeah.
And somehow he wants to say, I want to hold on to both of these modes at the same time. I want the freedom to step out, even as I recognize the goodness of embeddedness.
Right. That's a problem that doesn't have a solution. So it's best not to conceive it as a problem, but as a circumstance of which one can be aware. That's what I think is his message. We can hold this together in our own understanding.
That is, you read
that, and that's it becomes an issue of discernment, to go back to our starting point about a call, right? What is a call? Not everything is a call, otherwise I'm riding off madly in all directions, as one of our Canadian writers says. It's it has to be a matter of discernment. Now, there's no substitute for judgment.
Right. Yeah.
There's no system. There's no way of operationalizing or systematizing judgment. It's a personal achievement.
I mean, you read the piece I wrote for Plough. I mean, that was essentially what I was attempting to hold together. There was, on the one hand, the rootedness in a community, in a culture, in a tradition that precedes me, but on the other hand, this radical possibility to step out of it and to step into the freedom of friendship, and to kind of hold those two in tension, I think is essential. Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, I think that was Bonhoeffer's vision. I think it was Illich's vision. But always with that crucial caveat, right? That you don't jump too easily into a state of unguided, unbounded freedom, right? That unless it's governed by remembering, by tradition, right? Unless it's somehow bound back into the human continuum, it's just an easy way out. So
you've described your work at CBC Ideas as following a golden thread of thinkers. I mean, you've the people you've interviewed. I mean, astounding list of people. And I wonder, how would you describe what is the golden thread you are following? What kind of what is the common thing about all of the thinkers you were interviewing that drew your interest, would you say?
Well, you'd have to qualify a little, because I was a man in service to an amazingly indulgent executive producer, but still there were some times when I did what I was asked to do, right? It wasn't entirely my doing, but there is such a thread. I would say that that this goes back to the wine and the new wine and what it's to be poured into, is that probably having identified with the new left, that's what it was called, and that was what was there. And sometime in the later 70s, I realized that I couldn't belong to the left any more than I could belong to the right. That the change that I understood as trying to take place in the world was better comprehended by the image of a new age, right? Which would require a much more radical renovation of concepts. It would require a new era after the modern era, with new concepts, new ways of being. So then I began to try and probably assemble the various stars in my sky. Some I knew already, some I discovered into what you might say, you might call it a constellation, right? But I think there are many interesting differences between those thinkers. I mean, there's a very long essay on my website to give an example where I try to align Bruno Latour and Ivan Illich in relation to and Jim Lovelock to an extent, in relation to the image of Gaia, which for Illich was an appalling emblem of the system's age, a kind of disembodiment and an anti-earth, you might say. And Bruno, who adopted very much the image of Gaia as a way of figuring a living world after nature, where nature is understood as what opposes us, as not nature, as society. I mean, completely different ways of using language, and yet Bruno Latour discovered Illich very late in his life, and was, he makes very many positive references to him in his last book. I don't think Illich knew Latour, but so really different ways of speaking, right? And you would see that across the board in all these thinkers, right? That how does Northrop Frye speak, right? How does Carl Gustav Jung speak? How does Ivan Illich speak? How does Bruno Latour speak? Well, they all have their own ways, their own constructions, their own vocabularies. They're all related, and yet they're distinctively and really different. So my conception of the CBC, I don't mean this would be its entire activity. Obviously, there's room for music and laughter and many other things, in public broadcasting. But one of the tasks would be the winnowing of these languages, the open horizon that's implied. Whereas what I see now is a closed horizon and a deeply reactionary spirit, using reactionary in the sense of what is the major concern is to shore up all the failed institutions of modernity, right? Let's follow science instead of saying, what the hell is science, right? There are hundreds of sciences. Are they all the same? Do they all give the same counsel? I mean, behind this following science was a major attempt to squash and eliminate and obscure scientific dissensus. People didn't agree. People in virology and epidemiology, they didn't agree at all. There was no science to follow. It's pure myth. But there's a fearful retrenching on these modern myths. So I want to open the windows, open the doors, and start, seeking new horizons. And I think that involves very careful parsing of these thinkers, some of whom I tried to say had something to say to the contemporary situation, whether it's René Girard or Simone Weil or Ivan Illich or, Northrop Frye, to name one or George Grant, to name two who are, seemingly not even present in contemporary discussion, right? I mean, Canada has really forgotten its own. McLuhan would be another, right? There's really a remarkable absence of Innes, McLuhan, Grant, Frye, and you can name others of our intellectual heritage, which we don't even have any cognizance of, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one impact your work has had on me too, is I think of someone like Wendell Berry, who one strand of his work is to say the sort of America that is kind of being projected out in the world, Coca-Cola and big business and whatever we think of when we think of America. And he wants to say that is one vision of America that I don't stand for. I stand in this other tradition that has been obscured. And I think part of what your work has made me see is that there's this, to think of oneself as a Canadian and to have that be a coherent identity or a coherent tradition, that you can follow this line of thinkers that where it actually means something to say one is Canadian.
Well, the CBC used to, I mean, all these thinkers came to prominence through the CBC in part, right? There was a time when George Grant lectured on the CBC and Northrop Frye lectured on the CBC. And I don't think we do that anymore, right? So, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Wendell Berry, because Wendell Berry is a major source of, let's say, spiritual sustenance in my household. His stories are read and reread.
I'm reading Jaber Crow.
Oh, that's his masterpiece.
Yep.
That's an astonishing book. That's I was lucky to meet Wendell Berry about 10 years ago at an event in his honor, and to visit with him. And I mentioned my love for that book. And he said, that was my gift. I'm sure he would regard all his inspirations as gifts in some sense, but that seems to be a gift in some larger sense, right? So it's a very surprising book, right? It's a very surprising, the secret marriage is why, how would you come to that, right? How would you come the whole way in which the story is told? I mean, it's a major theological intervention, if I can speak that way. I don't know if Wendell would accept that, but I think it is, Anyway.
Well, I have two more questions.
All right, better hurry.
Very limited time. I think I have 5 or 7 minutes. I'm curious about your reaction to ChatGPT. If that was a phenomenon you've if that's a phenomenon you've observed.
To what?
This AI program where you can type a response into it and it'll generate a text response. And I've heard two different reactions to it. My brother had an interesting, drawing on your work, thought that the way you describe technologies having their effects come before the technology actually arrives on scene,
Yeah.
you can kind of see the effects of ChatGPT with the emergence of plastic language, and the kinds of responses you'll get from this AI, who will write your essays for you, will be very much in sort of generic plastic, bland language. And so the way has sort of already been paved. But then a different response is, my uncle was writing a government proposal for a grant, and so he just typed his query into ChatGPT, and then it just generated a perfectly legitimate grant proposal for him, and he just was able to submit that after making a few edits. And so there's the beautiful possibility of it replacing anti-human forms of writing, and kind of we no longer need to do that. Like this machine form of writing is no longer something actual human beings have to do. So these kind of opposite ways of seeing it come to mind.
Well, I haven't. My reaction to every new form of technology is to abstain. It's a joke around here that I didn't want voicemail, right? I right away see the shadow. Caller ID. No, I don't want to have the power to I don't like that person. So I haven't given much thought to this at all, but I'm inclined to abstain from it utterly, but I don't know. The thought that occurs to me when you say that it could free people by mechanizing certain forms of writing is whether we would want to have those forms of writing in the first place.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, those forms of writing are forms of writing that no human should have had to perform in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess just the closing question now is, thinking of your book, Ivan Illich, maybe some of your radio programs. Part of that work is a rigorous critique of the world in which we find ourselves. And I wonder if that's the negative side of your project, what do you see your work as pointing people towards, or in your own life, what do you see as how to, what is the vision of life that you're trying to point your readers towards, and that maybe you try to live out in your own life?
Well, I would to use Ivan's language, the capacity to be surprised, right? The capacity to meet you and have this happen, which I didn't know was going to happen this morning, so just openness. If the world, I don't think the messianic idea is anything other than that, is that a completely other world is present in every instant, right? Now, human life so far is essentially tragic. I mean, if you look back over the lives, the people I've known, both my father and my grandfather were in horrible wars. But that possibility is present in every moment, right? I heard one of the musicians, I'm an amateur musician, and one of the musicians I'm fond of is an American guitar player called Bill Frisell. And he said, well, isn't music an instance of what life should be, right? Where you're listening and you're seeking harmony. So yes, listening and seeking harmony is is as well as I could say it.
That's beautiful.
But I would like to convince the CBC, which I don't think I'll be able to do. But one is then animated by in writing a book which has no realistic prospects, right? It's coming out of left field, and yet somehow that hope is present in it, right? The hope that it could be, that it should be, that it might be different. Yeah.
Your hope, you're living in the hope of the causality of the call might be that you have responded to the call, and you are writing the book.
And don't worry, which I not a motto I don't always follow, right? Be not afraid, right? That's a beautiful saying, isn't it? So I was reading a friend's essay this morning, just before I talked to you. A guy called Mike Sauter, who wrote it on Front Porch Republic. But he's saying that this preoccupation with hate should really, hate is not the opposite of love. Fear is the opposite of love, right? Yeah. You should be concerned about fear, and then there might be less hate if there were less fear. But anyway, thank you, Julian. That was great fun.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed this as well. And it's lovely to meet you and get to talk with that golden voice on the radio.